So good morning and welcome everybody to Office Hours, and in particular to this topic with John Reuter, who is the board vice chair for Strong Towns and also is the vice president of state and local strategies at the League of Conservation Voters and a resident of Boston at the time, or at this time. Previously, he, and most critically here for our discussion, he's also served as a council member in Sandpoint, Idaho, and has a lot of experience not only with serving in offices and on committees, but also helping many people to do so. And so I'm so glad that John is able to join us on this topic. I called it, I got put on a committee, now what? And that can be committees, that can be commissions, that can be boards, that can be some of these functions where you're not elected to a position, but you are appointed to something, or you volunteer for something and then want to serve well. And one of our core principles at Strong Towns is that places flourish when strong citizens take hold of the place and take action together. And so that's why we've released a course on mobilizing your community for change. But that's also why I really wanted to take up this time to talk about these questions together. And so, John, I wanted to just throw it over to you. As you hear the voice of somebody crying out, "I got put on a committee. Now what?" What are some of the first thoughts that you would have as you think about how to help someone?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is thank you. Thank you for being willing to serve, and thanks everyone on this call who is serving or is interested in serving, or hopefully both. It is deeply appreciated as an important part frankly, of our movement to build strong towns together. These are key building blocks to what gets done. And the thing I think about is the first moment ever that Strong Towns went viral. It's the first time ever that it actually took off and was like this big YouTube thing. And it's a video we still hear about when Chuck goes out, people ask him about it. They don't know that he actually made it. And they'll say, it's this video of an engineer having a conversation with a community member about a road widening. And in this conversation, the engineer keeps explaining why the road needs to be widened and why we got to knock down all the trees and build it out and take up some of their yard and have this wider road. And the resident keeps going, I don't get it. Wait, why do we need to do this? This doesn't seem better. This doesn't seem safer. This doesn't seem to improve our quality of life here, right? And the resident isn't the expert in this conversation. The resident is a person who has a stake in their neighborhood and in their place. The expert is the engineer, right? And so when we talk about this idea of what value can you bring as someone who hasn't necessarily studied engineering or studied planning or really have any sort of formal expertise in these things, is your expertise as a person living there, of your expertise as someone who talks to their neighbors and looks around. And what I hope we have a chance to talk about today is a little bit about how you can actually grow that expertise, and also how you can effectively utilize that expertise, of the expertise that you have as an expert in your neighborhood. Because in that conversation is just so obvious, and we see conversations like this happening across our country every day, that the neighborhood expert is the expert we should be listening to, not the engineering expert. So those are that's sort of my overall funnel on the whole thing and the whole frame that I'm bringing to this. Let me see if there's anything else I wanted to say. I think we should, so we're going to talk about both how you do well as an expert and how you actually make sure that expertise gets through and how you can actually be effective in committee meetings. And then the second thing we're going to talk about, and we'll talk about these together in whatever order, but the theme I'm going to come back to is how to see things, how to actually refine that expertise and apply it, and to understand what's going on around you. Because that's one of the really, really key elements of this, is just, how would I put it? It's seeing the details in plans. It's being able to look at them. It's being able to see the details of place. And so we'll talk a little bit more about how you do this as we go on. So I think that's a good place to start it off there. And we'll go from there. Norm?
Yeah, I love it. That's awesome. And just that ability to be able to, one, highlight the benefit of going for a walk or taking notice of a place and then growing in care and consideration of what those things, of what that place needs. Our first question is, what suggestions do you have of ways to cultivate the skill of serving well in a local planning committee or on a commission? Nathan Howerlick asks, what kinds of skills and perspectives are most helpful on boards and commissions, and encourage the town to also keep that Strong Towns person on that commission? How do you develop those skills relatively quickly?
So I think a lot of people think that being on a committee and being a good member of a committee is about being right. and being really good at saying the right things and arguing for the right things and being super like persuasive and charismatic, and sure, that helps, right? But I think that obsession with being right often leads to like a wonkiness that doesn't get you where it, and we forget that committees and like politics, and if you're on a government board of any type at any scale, you're in politics now, not in that dirty, awful way that folks like me are involved in politics, but in that humble way that how our communities come together and how decisions are reached. And what that means is it's about people, and it's about your relationships to people. And so the most important thing you can do as a committee member to be effective quickly is to really get to know your fellow committee members, to talk to them, to invite them individually. Like quorum laws will not allow you to often all get together, but you can go individually out with other members and like get to know them and talk to them and understand what motivates them and how they're thinking. I would say paying attention to people who come before the board, right? It's important to read all your stuff, but it's also important to actually hear what the people are coming and saying you to. And then it's this other piece of learning how to look, and Norm really stole my thunder here of these really complicated ideas I'm going to give you, like taking a walk around your neighborhood, looking around, going to neighborhoods in your city that you haven't been to is really important. When I was on the city council, I actually made a point of walking every single street in our city. In a bigger city, that's not going to be possible. But you should still think about, where are neighborhoods I haven't been to? Where are people that I don't see? And making a point to go out to those places. And if you're always driving all the time, trying to try out the transit and figure out how to get there, right? Understand the experience of what it means there. Get out of your car when you get to those places and walk around a little bit. Start to get a sense of what different parts of your city feel like and what they are, right? Because that is your superpower. Is you cannot, you are not going to go through grad school in a month, being on a committee and have all this like book smarts and all those kind of things there necessarily. Some of you will bring that with you. But what you can do, and either way, what you need to do is build that expertise in place and that expertise of things. If you're on an economic development committee, I saw somebody saying they were on, go to the sites. If there are sites that the city is particularly working on and saying that are run down, go actually walk around those sites and see what's happening there and understand those places. If you're on a water committee or you're doing the utility committee, go actually and visit the utility sites. Ask the city staff will be thrilled that you care about this stuff. Actually try to get out there and see the physical place, the physical infrastructure, the people running these things. If you're on a parks committee, go and visit the parks, not just the parks you always go to, go and visit other parks in the city that you might not know about. Get a map of all the parkland and take the time to go and see it and walk around on it. And I'd say visit at different times of day and have a sense of what these places feel like and what are they like, right? So that's the first thing I would do, is build relationships and understand who am I serving with and how am I building those relationships, and two, ground yourself in place and ground yourself in where you're at. And then the other thing that doesn't hurt is, depending on the type of book, what you're doing here, but everybody ought to read these books. I brought props with me today, and I have books that aren't just Strong Towns books, but I'm going to say, read Chuck's books. It's worth doing. They are very, very useful and in plain language, helping explain things, and they will explain things that are useful to you, whether it's an economic committee or a transportation committee or a planning and zoning committee. They will give you a foundation. They will give you language to help communicate what you want in a way that's simple. And you can borrow these things too, right? You can send excerpts of this to fellow committee members. You can send Strong Towns articles to fellow committee members. And it's not bad to introduce that when you talk to them and say, well, I'm really excited about this organization called Strong Towns that works with communities just like ours. And I would always emphasize that, just like ours and people around the country. And they're trying to figure out how to build strong and resilient places. And I'm really excited about that. And I'd love to share some stuff I'm reading with you. And I'd love to hear about what you're reading and excited about. That's what I kind of do. Ground yourself in Strong Towns, of course, but two, the people and the place. And that's sort of my starting advice there.
Yeah, that really resonates, especially taking books and sharing them, or, taking advantage of them yourself, because one of the things that I did was to share a book with the Chuck's Strong Towns book with my local city councilor. And he was fairly new in office. He was sort of said to me, I've never read a book that was so like plain, simple, easy to read for me to be able to understand like what's going on here. There was particular things on how to understand the zoning code, but his whole focus was, how do I just get up to speed on like, what is the task of building a community and a complete community and a vibrant community in that way. And so I've got another question then about, this is from Richard McFarland. who asks, how do you balance your approach to doing a good job as a committee member while at the same time doing a good job as a devoted to logic or what is best needed for your community individuals? So Tom, how do you put up with maybe some of the runarounds, the slow sluggishness that can sometimes begin to set into a committee where there are just procedures that need to be followed versus that like bigger goal of having a vision, having ideas of where you want to take this?
So Richard, I'm going to answer a version of your question, how I'm understanding, and then push me back on track here if I'm not actually answering the right question here. I'd love you can correct me and make sure I actually answer the question you have here, because there's a couple different ways that I could understand this. So to me, the challenge is sometimes, how do I apply the specific letter of the things in front of me and the specific things that I have to do in front of me versus my understanding as a community member, and how do those things mix together? So I'm going to answer that question, which I think is useful. And then Richard, you can redirect me to whether there's a different question here that I'm missing as well here. And I'm happy to address it more specifically. To me, I think there will often be times when experts will come before you and say, we have to do this very specific thing, and rules demand this, or logic demands this, or this is what we have to do it. Or you might even say, oh, this is the reading of it. And I would say, you know, my wife is an attorney. And what I've learned from watching my wife look at laws over the years is how much they disagree about them all the time. And that logic is not as binding as we might think it is. That rules are actually more complex than we might think that they are. And so I think people should follow the law, and people should follow the rules, and they should follow those things. But they should think about, they should be thinking about, you should really focus in your mind an interpretation, the most generous interpretation towards the values that you're bringing as a community member. All right, that's one way. Here's a different way, Richard, and tell me if maybe we'll stumble to the one that you meant here, and we're just going to do field alterations. A different one is, how do I get along with people when they're so clearly wrong about everything? Richard's going, yes, that's the one. Okay, how do I get along with people when they're so clearly wrong about everything? That is a tougher one. And I would say, I think the trick is to get them to be less wrong about things. And I think, look, I would not vote for things that or support things that you think are bad ideas, right? But I also wouldn't necessarily be a grouch while I disagreed with people. And I think that that's like a really like key part of being a part of anything, is like an amicable disagreement, because you don't want to distance yourself from your fellow committee members, because you're not going to get anywhere, right? You want to say, look, I see it differently. Here's why I see it the way that I see it. Here are the things that I'm caring about and why I'm going the direction I am, and really laying those things out in a clear way, but a respectful way, and say, I recognize that others are seeing it differently than I am, but here's how I'm seeing it, and here's why. And then I just stick to my guns on those things. But I don't think you're going to get anywhere by making it clear how dumb you think the other members of the committee are, even if they're being especially really dumb. And they will be sometimes, and it's very frustrating. You know, not anyone I served with. All the people I served with, even when they disagreed with me, were great people. And it's too bad that I later ran campaigns to get them unelected. That was just a coincidence that happened later and had nothing to do with me being frustrated with them. No, so these are the challenges you have there. But those are the things I would do. Is I would really try to be good-natured about it. I would try to be clear about it, and I would try to make sure that you don't define it as I'm logical and you're not, even if it's feeling that way. And I would also try to blend some value conversations with logic. What I see people sometimes do is say, well, here's why we should do this, and here's why it makes fiscal sense, and da 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 da. And I would try to also add some value language into it. So I would try to say, you know, I'm very concerned about this because I think it's going to really increase costs in our community in the long term. And I think a lot about like families in our community who are struggling with, you know, this rate or that rate. And I think if we do this, I know in the short term it's going to make it lower, but I worry that 30 years down the line, here's how it's going to cost people more money, and here's why. And, you know, I've read some things about this on this website, Strong Towns. Here's an article about it. I'd encourage people to read this stuff. And I recognize, you know, we may just not agree on this one, and I respect the disagreement, but I really think we're getting it wrong here, and I'm concerned. So it'd be a tone of sympathy. I'd intermix values and logic together. But, you know, it's trickly. And I think humble curiosity is a good way to put it. I think that's the smart idea, Rodney, is to have that. But sometimes you have to be very careful, because sometimes when you're asking other people questions, it starts to feel very like condescending, or that they're not necessarily on your team. And so I always worry about giving that advice, but you do want to like try to get them into conversation, I think is smart. And if you can get them to start to actually like interact with you and get them to actually talk about the specifics, that can be really helpful. And it can specifically be helpful to draw them into a conversation that's a little bit more particular or builds relationships. So whenever we can, it's good to go on site visits together and actually be out there looking at the thing together. Oftentimes the problem with bad committees are they're being bad because staff is also leading them astray and sending them in the wrong direction. And so I think it can be really useful to try to engage the committee members in talk rather than engaging the staff in talk, of saying like, can we have a conversation about it? Can you help me understand like where you're coming from? I heard what staff's concerns are. What are those are those the same concerns you're having? Can you talk about where you're at on it? And trying to do some of that conversation outside of meetings too. But it can be hard. It can be really hard. Here's what I would say to you, that's if you're in a committee where you're not getting what you want, where things are going wrong for you, and you're trying to be humble where you can, and you're struggling, and everything else, is this. In almost every community where I have seen progress, someone is first, and it almost always goes poorly for them. In any community where I've seen progress, someone is first, and it almost always goes poorly for them. People get angry with them. People think they're disagreeable. Some of these people are very nice people. Some of these people are very stubborn people. There's different characteristics that let us be that first person. You are valuable. It is good that you are there. It is worth it in showing up and having those conversations. And in time, other people will show up if you keep having those conversations and you reach out to neighbors and keep doing it. But it is frustrating to be first. I was very lucky when I was on the city council. I got to not to be first, but the person who was first is the person who actually had to step back from council and actually got me appointed and asked for me to be appointed to council before I was elected. A mentor of mine, Steve Lockwood, and Steve Lockwood was an incredibly brilliant person that everyone else in council hated. And Steve was right about almost everything, and Steve and I agreed on almost everything. And I wouldn't be in the work that I'm doing now without the work that Steve did and being first. And I wouldn't know things about policy that I know now. And I wouldn't be able to get there. And sometimes helpful having somebody who's a little bit further right, not right, left, right, but like right, wrong, right? Somebody who's a little bit more willing to go to the boldest, rightest solution, because it creates space for compromise that moves the dichotomy in the right direction. So that's what I would say, is there is value to you being there, and you don't have to always win for there to be value to you being there. So I hope that's helpful in the how to actually make some progress, but also like a recognition that like sometimes you're not, but that's not the same thing as losing.
Yeah, that's great. That's powerful. Just to think, if you're going to be first, it's probably going to be tricky. And I think of it in some ways, to use a sports analogy, when a golfer gets to a certain level, they get a coach, and the coach will say, you need to rebuild your swing, which means you need to do everything differently compared with the way that you thought you were doing. And in many ways, like communities need to rebuild their swing, or they need to, figure out how to pitch, do some of these core basics. And it's been decades following a very familiar pattern, following, what comes naturally, what seems to, and yet is a consequence of so many, decisions that are baked into our systems, in our codes, and our legislation. And as a result, it feels like you're asking them to do the impossible. And I've heard of athletes that said, I just thought my coach was wrong about me. I didn't mind that he had success with other places, but like, I was different. I needed to throw a ball this way, or I needed to hit a ball in this way. And the reality is, like, once I followed through, once I followed that process, I actually became way stronger than I ever could have been, and sort of was able to hit that next level. But that takes us into our next question, which is, what's the best way as a new member to engage with a committee of largely older members that might be already feeling deflated? So I don't want to cast too many general aspersions on anyone, but just there can be that pattern, maybe even more experienced members that are more sort of on track, or on a track that they're comfortable with, and maybe not always open to new ideas.
I was wondering if this was also about the way I read this question was that it's about that they're there and they're feeling like they're just not listened to. It doesn't matter what we do. I think about a lot of like pedestrian committees, like they're meeting for years, they do their work, they say, hey, we should improve these walkways, hey, we should do this stuff, and the city never does anything. And so what's the point? We'll do our stuff, but boy, is this frustrating to do. And that happens to all sorts of environmental committees, economic development, whatever the committee is, especially these advisory committees, it can be very frustrating for people who've been there forever, or feel like, neighborhood committees where like the city never actually comes and addresses our problems. This is pretty normal. It's pretty normal to enter into an environment where people have been there a long time and they're either deflated because they just don't think things are going to happen, or they just believe that they've done as much as they can. They've made some progress, and the progress is just kind of where it's at. What would I say about this? I think enthusiasm helps. I think that it's something that our cities need more of, is just a belief in possibility, a belief in what can be done. And you, as someone new to the committee, and you, particularly as someone who might be younger than other members, can really help bring in a sense of enthusiasm, a sense of possibility, a sense of excitement, and like just showing up and like continuing to be excited, even in the face of other people not, is totally worth it. And I would actually focus on being clear and sharing your excitement about things. I would go out of my way to celebrate any successes that do happen, right? It is very important. And I would look for places to drive some initial successes. And so I will look at those things. Now, how would I go about trying to look at those things if we're a committee and we're being like, maybe the members are right. Maybe we're being ignored. Maybe things aren't actually going so well here. Well, you got recently appointed to the committee by somebody. I would actually go talk to the person and say, who appointed you, or was the ally that helped you get appointed. So whether that's the mayor directly or a city council member or someone else, like, how'd you end up on this committee? How'd you end up there? The staff member, and just say, I'm on this committee and I'm really excited, but a lot of people aren't. And the sense I'm getting is they're just feeling deflated, that their time here isn't valued, or they're not able to get anywhere, or it doesn't really matter. And what can we do to actually make a difference? Where's a place where our contributions would actually like help shift a conversation? Or where's a place where we can actually help make something happen? What could we do? And I'd look for those opportunities yourself too there. I love going places. I think I've emphasized this on every answer so far. Why stop now? Get together, do a site visit to somewhere in your community. Like, having people actually go somewhere can be exciting. It's especially exciting that something that's happening there, either good or bad, like having us look at it, talking about it. And again, I would just say, like, your enthusiasm is an asset. It is the asset that our communities need more than anything else, is people who are excited and passionate to serve. Make sure that other members are feeling that passion and showing up in a concrete way. Those are my ideas about this in general.
I just think that kind of takes that responsibility, and I love the idea of going back to the person that appointed you and saying, like, you gave me a new responsibility to enter into this process. What can we achieve together? What can we do with that? I want to take up the next question from Nathan, who's serving on a planning commission in Calgary. And he asks, basically, we can give council advice at various points, but we don't have any involvement in policy development. How can I and others in similar spots use the role to encourage our council to make decisions that can make our town a stronger place?
Yeah, I think this is just awesome. Like, I don't think there's any, like, this doesn't seem like this is pretty normal. That, I mean, it varies from planning commission to planning commission. But it sounds like you have the ability to make suggestions on policy to them through more intimate meetings. I would take advantage of that. And I would pick concrete things that come out of the work you've been doing where you're reviewing plans. So I would connect it to things that you're already doing, because that's going to increase your credibility. Okay, so this is a good time to introduce this idea, I think. So when I got on the Sandpoint City Council, I brought with me and I would add to this, I had a little box. In fact, I meant to grab it today, but I don't know. I still have this box somewhere. And in it, I had note cards. And on each note card, I wrote something that I wanted to get done. A policy change, we want to eliminate parking requirements. We want to make it easier to have historic buildings. We want to, I don't know, a lot of them were about parking requirements. I was quite obsessed about that. But we want to actually have parks within near neighborhoods. We want to do whatever the things were, right? And it was filled with probably about 40 of these different cards, probably 10 of them that I started with, and I kept adding to them as I saw things. And as opportunities came up, right, on council, I would go through my cards, and like as we're doing budget process, or as we're doing a review of something or talking about code again, and I would just doing a comprehensive plan review or whatever, and I'd try to figure out how to make some of these things happen, right, as we got there. And the point wasn't you don't have to literally have these cards. I did, because I was a very weird 25-year-old, 24-year-old when I got in council and precocious and had the time to do this. And so I had all my cards there and I'd lay them all out and then I'd remove ones where I was like, oh, I was wrong about that. That wasn't a good idea. I was like, oh, no, it shouldn't be a 4-lane limit. It should be a 3-lane limit. And really only 2 lanes we should allow in town. And, you know, those kind of things we revised. But look for the opportunities that are coming to you. Where are the moments where there's a policy recommendation that ties to the work that you're doing as a committee? So we're seeing these plans come forward to us in this way, and here's the challenge we're seeing about them. Or we think it should be easier to do blank when we look at the code. And so we only see plans that people are always doing this and actually be better if they did this, but clearly the code forces them to do this. Can we change this, right? I'm trying to think of, I can come up with some concrete examples of these things too, but they're usually things like being able to build to street or have less parking requirements, or, you know, which is a really good example, right? If you want to deal with parking requirements in your town, it's great to say, look at all this parking we're building. And we had to approve all these plans with all this parking, and yet it's totally unnecessary. Nobody's using it, which is almost always true. Can we do something about this? Or we're not seeing a lot of permits right now for houses coming in. We don't see housing requirements, and we're seeing there's actually all these extra requirements on housing to take place here. What can we do to actually allow this to make it happen? So I'd really try to link it to your work when I make policy recommendations, because it will then make it more powerful and persuasive because it's tied to an expertise that you have and your job as a planning and zoning commissioner. So those are my 2 thoughts: is be ready and have a list of sort of the kind of things you want to do, and then look for which one of those things that you'd like to do match up with the opportunities. Because maybe not the dirty secret, the secret of like public service in a lot of ways is there is so much work to be done. Richard knows his committee won't do any of it, right? But there's so much work to be done that we can actually do to drive these things forward. And it almost doesn't matter where you start. What's important is that you do start and that you're making progress and pushing it forward. And so I would look for something that where you're most pushing through an open door. That would be my my advice. And then I would say those private meetings are like a superpower, because they are private sessions for the council to listen to you. They're without the council having the political pressure of having a bunch of people in front of them. If you're finding resistance in those meetings, I would be thinking about how could you get some friends to do some public push pressure too, to complement that. But in general, that's really, really valuable time and a real big opportunity to have real conversations with them. And the other thing I would say, to come back to what we talked about earlier in this conversation, is I wouldn't just give them advice, I would ask questions. I would say, how are you looking at this? What are your big concerns? And then I'd offer policy remedies that meet some of their concerns, right? So I would say, what are you thinking about housing in our community? What are you thinking about this? Oh, you think affordable housing is a problem too? Well, we got together and we have some ideas about how to make housing, or how we could change the zoning code to make housing more affordable in our community. And then I'd bring those forward, right? So get them to tell you what the problem is, and then you can bring the solutions to that problem. And there almost always are good, strong towns progress that can be tied to that. All right, there's a few ideas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that speaks also to one of the great benefits of serving on a commission or a committee is the benefit of advanced notice or advanced timing, that you will often have some understanding of what's taking place within your community before maybe the newspaper reports on it, or before plans are formalized or finalized. And as a result, you actually do have an opportunity to really weigh in on it and align with where staff are already tasked with working, to try to say, let's make that work smarter, have better outcomes, be much clearer. And yeah, I love that you shared the story of the cue cards as well, and just the understanding, you know, how do we get this to happen? Sometimes it isn't by putting all your cards on the table right up front, but instead at those key moments saying, well, this is one way that we can resolve this problem. This is one way that we can address this disparity between what we want and what we're seeing, and to say, well, there's an answer for that, or there's a solution for that we can work towards. I've got another question from Millicent, who submitted a question asking, how do you increase committee engagement? What makes a committee effective in accomplishing things?
Well, in terms of the second part of the question, what makes a committee effective in accomplishing things? Committee engagement helps. So there's that, right? But how do we actually get the committee engaged, and how do we make them effective? And these things are very intertwined. So focused, specific goals help us make a committee effective. Oh gosh, I brought materials over with me, but I left this one back there somewhere on my bookcase here. But somewhere in my bookcase back there is a booklet of Trees of Sandpoint. And it is a guide to impressive trees around town. And this happened because our forestry committee decided to do a project where they were going to go and find the best trees in town and then print a booklet up of all the great trees in town. I think they figured out a way to self-fund this thing and all those kind of things too. This led to a guide on the best trees to plant in town to help do it. It created additional excitement about trees and led to us actually starting a program where we planted 100 trees a year around Sandpoint every year, based on us starting to realize and appreciate trees. But it all started with that forestry committee actually having a solid concrete project they were going to accomplish. One thing they were going to actually do, which was, we want to celebrate great trees in town. Another example, pedestrian committee. People can often get locked in like these big grand plans, like we're going to create a pedestrian committee in town. Our pedestrian committee was its most effective when it focused on a specific intersection. When it said, someone died in this intersection, we need to make it better to cross. And you know what? We made it better to cross because it brought specific plans, achievable plans, things we could do immediately with a price tag attached, and we got it done. So it's that kind of focus of saying, what is a specific task, a specific challenge we're going to take up? And the more specific and localized it is, the better. We're going to go as a committee and go look at that thing together, right? And then going and like forming a plan and figuring out what to do about it really does stuff. Now, here's the part. No matter how effective a committee is, no matter how much engagement there is in the committee, almost always in my experience, somebody's not engaged. Don't let the unengaged people stop you from making progress. Do whatever the people showing up are going to do, right? Try to get to like a critical mass and try to pull some more people in and like do some scheduling to make it work. But like, don't worry that so-and-so is never coming, and don't spend all your time there. I love this. Gallup has this program called Strength Finder, and it's all about this idea that you should lean into your strengths as like an individual. Like an individual, we should like lean into our strength, and that's how you're going to be powerful in life, right? As a committee, you're going to be powerful if you lean into your committee's strengths. So don't worry, whatever your committee is going to be great at, like lean into a project that leans into that committee's strengths, lean into the members of that committee that are enthusiastic and ready to go, and build on that. And don't worry and spend all your energy trying to engage the 2 or 3 people who aren't engaged at all. Like focus on a core group. Even if the core group of you is a minority of the committee, I would focus there. Focus where there's excitement, focus where there's enthusiasm, and invite other people to join you, right? And invite people to join you. Long term, some of those people leave the committee. Hopefully we can bring on new excited people. But that's the general thought that I would take there. I will also say, when people start seeing that things are happening, they're going to want to get involved. When they start seeing that your committee's done something, they're going to become more likely to go in, right? So like results beget more excitement and more results.
How do you get noticed to be on a committee? Do you have any suggestions? This is just more of a general question. Someone that's interested, we talk about mobilizing locally to take action, and one of those things can be getting more involved. And certainly we would say, you know, join a local conversations group or join some group and be an ambassador of good ideas. But are there ways to make yourself make it known that you're available in a way that may be quite beneficial for your community?
I mean, many cities have processes where you can actually apply for committees, right, and go and do it. But I would say go and talk. If you're in a very, it depends what kind of community you're in. So let me just note, this is one where it really is different in a big city versus what it's like in a small town. In a small town, they're almost always looking for people to show up. In big cities, they're often always looking for people to show up, but it's a little bit more complicated and the processes are bigger and more involved there. In either case, what I would do is I would go to whatever is the highest level person in city government that you have easy access to. So if you're in a small town that maybe, well, you can just sit down with the mayor and say, I'm interested in serving. Here are the kind of things I'm excited about. I would love to serve on a committee on these kind of things. Is there a place where you need people right now? If I was in a bigger city, I might try to reach out to my council member or to their office and go and tell my council member, hey, I'm interested in serving. Here's the kind of things I'm interested in. Is there opportunities? How can I get more engaged? I'm really interested in being involved. I want to help, et cetera, et cetera. That will oftentimes there are easy doors in there. The other thing I would say is, particularly in larger contexts, don't be obsessed about the idea that the committee you need to serve on is actually an official government committee. There are a lot of other committees from like just local conversations could do advocacy outside of it. There are civic groups in your community already that need more support and more involvement, and they will help point you towards ways that you can be useful and projects can be useful. Your neighborhood association, I bet you, is struggling to get enough board members. If they're not, that's really exciting. That probably means they have other things for you to do than if they already are all full. So there are a lot of opportunities to serve in your community, and one of the ways you'll get noticed is by serving in those other ways. That end up there. I was the head of our downtown business association when I got appointed to city council originally. I was on the board of our local theater, right, at the same time, our community-owned theater. What else was I doing? I was on the board of the Arts Alliance at the time, right? So I did not, when I got plucked up and asked to come serve in city government and then ran and was reelected, but when I got plucked up to do that, it was based on my involvement in other places in the community that were not government, and other places where I was trying to help out, from economic development to the arts to downtown work. So find places to plug in and don't think that there's only one way to have value there. And a lot of things we've talked about today about how to be effective, they also apply to boards and to other like community groups, not just to government bodies.
Yeah, totally. We have, I mean, sometimes people will say, the only thing I care about in my city is cycling. We say, but if you can extend your interest so that way the local arts center, you get involved there, involved in some of their committees perhaps, and all of a sudden you're asking them to actually consider, cycling or bike parking. Next thing you know, you're like, oh, we've created a little node where, we're beginning to resemble what we want to see for the rest of the community, even in some of these places, or a theater that gives more thought to the needs of vulnerable users or things like that. I've got another question here that comes in. A difficult part of being on a planning commission is knowing when the neighborhood defenders are right and wrong. In the locomotive session that John gave, it's on the Strong Towns Academy about talking to a NIMBY, you suggested asking whether the people opposing a project have historically been excluded from decision-making and picturing whether people would use the project. Can you expand on that? That's a question from Nathan, if you can expand on that.
Yeah, and locomotive sessions all recorded. So for you, it may be very recent, but for me, it was quite some time ago. So we'll see if I give the same advice that I gave previously or not. So this gets really this challenge, right? Is that sometimes people oppose a project, and at Strong Town, sometimes we on their side, right? For example, if people are proposing that we take a road and we widen it through their community, what we talked about at the very top of this call, and said, let's drive a bigger road through this town and knock down people's front yards and remove the bicycle lanes and remove, the trees, we would think almost every time, probably every time, that that's a bad idea. And we would think that the people in that neighborhood really ought to be listened to, right? Instead of actually being literally bulldozed over. So that's the way that we would think about those sorts of that sort of dynamic. Similarly, on the other hand, sometimes people are like, look, I don't want additional housing in my neighborhood. This is very, very common, right? My neighborhood should be single family houses, put the houses somewhere else. And we would say almost every single time, in fact, I think we'd say every single time, that there should always be allowed, the next increment of development should always be allowed. So people should be, it's reasonable to not expect it to be an apartment building put next door to your single family house potentially, but a duplex should be allowed. That's kind of our thought about housing. We could talk more about that in a separate conversation about housing perhaps. So what do you do? How do you know if these are the people who are arguing against a big road or against housing with an unfamiliar situation and it's unclear and it's cloudy a little bit? This is the two-part test that I suggested there, and I'll pick it up here again, and maybe I'll even formalize my Reuter's two-part test on how to judge NIMBYs. So part one is, are these people who've historically been excluded from decision-making? Are you making a decision about a part of town that's generally been neglected, where people are disproportionately poor, where people have other intersecting identities that mean that they've been ignored more? This certainly could be race, is certainly one lens I would use. Economics, another lens I would use. I think about Seattle and about how LGBT communities in Seattle have been treated actually rather poorly by city government and actually continue to be in ways that are interesting, as well as Black communities. So I would just think about, and poor people everywhere are often ignored. I would listen more to people who have been listened to less. Because it is more likely that they are bringing something to you that is useful. That's not a veto. Identity is not a, you automatically get what you want because of who you are, or you should automatically agree with people based on it, but it is a clue that we should be listening more and be paying more attention and trying to make sure that we're understanding what's going on, because it's more likely that we're missing something and the government historically has been missed the thing that they're trying to tell us. So that's what I would say there is I would listen more in those instances, and I would try to pay more attention. And that's a real clue in there. The second part that I would say is what you're building for people? Is what you're going to do actually benefit people in some way? And who are those people that the project is benefiting? And do they include the people who live there? Right? Not do they think they're going to benefit, but will they actually benefit from the project? Because I actually think that when you increase, when you allow people to build the next increment of housing, I think the whole community actually gets richer and more exciting and more affordable, and we can see who's actually benefiting from that directly. I think when we build a wider road, we can see that people who live there are not benefiting, they're being harmed. And so I would just think about who's benefiting, who are those people in concrete terms, who are we actually helping here? And if it's just an abstract idea that you're helping, if it's helping people move through your community faster and doesn't actually do anything for the people who are living there and actually ruins their state of life, right? If it helps people over on the other side of town but hurts these people's lives, those are all moments where I would be skeptical, right? So you should be able to do two things. You should be able to look at the group, you should look at the community and say, like, are these a bunch of the same people we always hear from holding up progress, who have disproportionately had power and they're angry about change because they're used to always getting to do what they want and always getting their way? That's one thing I'd say. Or are these people we haven't listened to normally? And in either case, I would still listen, but I would especially try harder to listen to people who we've ignored historically. And then two, who is benefiting from this project in concrete terms? Who are we specifically helping? How is it helping them? Why is it helping them? And if I hadn't already, I would go to the specific spot and I would look around, right? I would go to the specific spot and I would walk it. I would look at it. I would try to figure out what's happening here. Those are the kind of things that I would do, because I think that details really matter. And so I'm going to make a couple recommendations of things that I think are really useful beyond Strong Towns books. I brought some other books with me. So here are now some John Reuter reading suggestions before I get into other stuff to think about details, which will help you with NIMBYs. So I like this book that you may have heard of. It's called A Pattern Language by Christopher Alexander. This is a classic text. It is all about specific, very, very specific pieces of the built environment and why they should be built in certain ways. You don't have to agree with Christopher Alexander on everything. Totally fine to disagree with him. What's cool about Christopher Alexander is he was an architect, and he actually had people walk to places and put stakes in the ground on planning sites to actually figure out and look at how the building was going to be built, right? Because he was trying to be able to see the actual footprint, to actually think about things in real terms. This book will help you think about the built environment in real ways, in real terms. I don't agree with every one of his advice, but what's important is it gets you to think about details of place. So I think it's very useful on that. Secondly, I love this book called City Comforts: How to Build an Urban Environment. This is all a book filled with urban details of just very small things that just show you how it creates the built environment. This will help you see why a street feels nice or why it doesn't. It will see things like let users control traffic signals. If you're in charge of like a street intersection, you may never even thought about this before, but now you're like, oh, now I go to ask the engineer, hey, will those light signals, will they do anything when you push them? It gives you a way to think about details of place in a much more detailed way. Even if you're on like you're on arts commission, this is great. There's ideas about what makes public art good and why and how it functions. There's ideas about here about how to make parking like be less intrusive on a neighborhood. If there's large parking requirement, this will give you ideas on how to do it. So I just love this book because this book is bigger picture and a little denser, but I think is really helpful. And this book is like my fun, more candy book with lots of pretty pictures and little paragraphs of text. Let infants and parents travel in comfort, like super smart little things here. Some of them are things that are like you can do in your committee, some aren't. Some of the things that businesses need to do. It talks about like width of parking spots and entrances to things. It's just stuff you might not have noticed. And so if you're on like a planning and zoning committee or an arts committee or a neighborhood committee, I just think this is really valuable in helping you see your place in more detail and think what's going on. Okay. And then I studied political philosophy in college. That was my deep thing. So totally unpractical stuff. And I continue to like totally unpractical stuff, but this is a practical philosophy book by Daniel Kemmis, the former mayor of Missoula, called The Good City and the Good Life. You can only buy it used now, but it's pretty cheap. You just buy up a copy that's pretty marked up usually. And this is a philosophical book about what it means to be in a community. So this is the book when you're saying like, how do I deal with idiots? I think that was my version of Richard's question. He asked it much nicer than I did. But how do I deal with idiots? This book helps talk about how not to see them as idiots and how to like work with them and how to build community, and talks about the work of being in a community in a way that's empathetic, in a way that's pulling people together, and what that work actually feels like and what it can be. And this is the book I go back to when I want to be inspired again about being in a community, and when I want to think about what communities can do and what government service can be, whether that's elected office or appointed office. This is my favorite book about that. And it's just a really, it's sort of like for folks, if you like, I'm trying to think if you like Annie Dillard or something like that, but if you like a humble book about humble change and something that's a little bit more philosophical, but with concrete examples and tied to cities, this is just a really beautiful book. So The Good City and The Good Life. And Norm tells me we're going to put links to all of this inside of the chat later. I didn't show many of the books in advance. I was very uncooperative, but we will put them all out there and you'll be able to get access to all of those things. I think we might have some more questions here, so I'm happy to jump to other ones here.
Yeah, had a question from Jackie asking, so we talked, I think in the book recommendations of, how to think and what to think and sort of what's a philosophy of building in place. But there's also sort of the practical reality that you need to get up to speed on things like Robert's rules and parliamentary procedures. And so she asked, is it common for committees and commissions to use parliamentary procedures? Do I need to be well-versed on Robert's rules of order in order to serve? Or is there a hack? Is there a way to pass through that valley of the shadow of death? Whatever that looks like, because it can be really soul destroying to be confronted with someone that is amending the amendment, and then there's a debate and all of those things, especially when you don't know the language that they're using and you're unfamiliar with it. What level of familiarity would you recommend? Do you have any suggestions on how to get up to speed with a base level of what's necessary to do that?
Yeah, so I'm a rules nerd, right? I love parliamentary procedure. I love Robert's Rules of Order. I love them almost as much as my wife do, she used to be the parliamentarian for the Idaho Senate. So boy, does she know rules, more rules than I know and how they work. And here's the good news, it doesn't matter at all. You do not need to know these things. Legislators in the legislature, they show up, they don't know the rules at all, ever. They never do. They never understand them. City council members show up, they never know the rules, right? They don't learn. I worked with people for years who never learned the rules the entire time we were there, got corrected. Just don't worry about it. And no, it's okay. If somebody says, oh, you can't do that, just say, here's the little trick, point of orders, what you say to get to ask a question if you're in Robert's Rules of Order. Point of order, can you please explain to me? Or parliamentary inquiry, I don't know, you'll figure it out very quickly how to ask a question. Just ask. Just say, I'm trying to figure out how to do this. How do I do this blank thing I want to do? I'm trying to figure out how to amend this. How can I amend it? So there's a way to get recognized, to answer your question. Don't be embarrassed about it. Who cares? They're stupid. Okay, let me just say this: someone who loves parliamentary rules and Robert's Rules of Order, they're silly, stupid things that were created to try to create order. They now often create disorder and make things more complicated. They're still what you got to follow. Try to follow them, but don't get hung up on it. And if you get something wrong, who cares? That's not why you're there. You're there to fight for your community. You're there to advocate for something. Focus on those things. Focus on the place. Focus on the people. Focus on accomplishing things for them. And just don't get hung up on those things. And don't be embarrassed if you get called out for not understanding a rule. It's totally silly. It doesn't matter. It happens to people every day. In fact, I now work with Congress sometimes. And you know what, members of Congress, they don't know the rules either. Some of them do, but most of them do not. And they get gavelled all the time for breaking them, right? It happens all the time. So don't let yourself get embarrassed by the rules. Don't let somebody bully you with the rules. If you want to do something, just ask how to do it. And it's their job. It's very clear that under the rules, you're allowed to know how to do things, and they're supposed to tell you how to do things if you ask how to do them. So figure out whatever the rules are, where you are, how you need to ask to do things. Don't get embarrassed about it. No one is going to care. Try to follow the rules. Don't be a jerk about it and like totally disregard them. Do try your best. Just to be like, this is what we talked about earlier, like you want to be an agreeable person and a friendly person. That's why you do that. But it's okay to get mixed up, right? It's okay. So you don't need to know them at all. Almost nobody knows them when they go in. Almost nobody knows them after years of service. It's very, very normal to be confused by those things. I say as someone who loves the rules, who actually has multiple copies of Robert's Rules of Order behind me, has multiple different Senate's version of rules back here. I've got it all, and I'm just giving you a permission now to let those of us who obsess about it, and you are free to just go and serve. Okay.
Yeah, Well, time has certainly flown by, and I think that's such an interesting and an important point. Even, I mean, Robert's rules is one thing, but even just the general practice of serving and striving to serve well can feel really discouraging if you feel like you have missed something, or even missed something critical because you did presented a motion that wasn't properly in order. But I take your point, which is like, let it be like water off a duck's back. Like, continue to ask, like, how do I get to the thing that I'm seeking? How do I, within the limits, continue to push forward to this? Now we're limited by time because I didn't realize that we're almost at the top of the hour. So I'm going to give kind of a closing opportunity for closing words from John, and then we're going to turn off the recording and go into our after party session. But any closing thoughts as we finish up, John?
Yes, I always have more thoughts, and so I'll share some now, and we'll see how relevant they are or not. I just want to, I guess the most important thing that I want to say as we close up here is just to express gratitude again. I mean, it's pretty extraordinary that the 20-something of you who decided to jump on a call with somebody who probably, maybe you saw me on some other webinar before, but probably didn't know, because you're trying to figure out how to better serve your community and how to do more for people where you live. That's phenomenal. Like, thank you. Thank you for putting that time in. Thank you for caring about it. And I will tell you, if you are willing to take the time out of your day to do something like this, you're going to be great. You are a top class, like, volunteer, community member, committee member, person in your community. Like, you are putting the work in, you are trying to figure it out, and it will pay dividends. And what I've seen more than anything else is two things that drive change in communities. Okay, so one is passion, is actually caring about these things, of wanting to see something change, of being excited about it, of being willing to go out there, like, and go and do it, like showing up to a meeting like this, of being like ready and passionate and ready to drive it. That's part one. Part two, endurance, to keep showing up day after day after day, to keep showing up when you don't get, the committee doesn't go the way you want, when you go, oh, I haven't quite hit it through. The people who can people who have passion and then keep having endurance and keep going, almost always see results in the end. Almost always see progress drive forward. It's just how it works, right? If what people choose to invest their time and energy into, that's what happens there. And a lot of our problems come from people just stopping believing. Like, a lot of why our local governments don't work today as well as they were is people stop believing in them and people stop showing up. Like, that is the core problem we have in public life today, is a cynicism that we can't actually make things better. And we can. And all of you can, and I suspect all of you are, because you're taking the time to come places like this, and I suspect all of you will keep doing it. So I want to express my gratitude for what you're doing now to build strong towns, what you'll do in the future to build strong towns, and that we're here to support you in those efforts with sessions like this and sessions going, because at the end of the day, you're the ones making the world that we believe in come into being. So thank you.